we all know that this journey is coming to an end at some point. But when I think about the experience I had at 4, knowing that there's something outside my physical body that continues, that's conscious, and then the encounters I've had with beings on the other side, and whether they're strangers, multidimensional beings, which we'll get to later, deceased relatives, the core component again is consciousness, it's love, it's connection. And what are we supposed to do with this? Really, it's like, what's the point? So when we have these discussions about what these things could be, and people have asked me, and I could trot out a whole book of experiences, but in the end, it's the bottom line is, how is this going to help folks? Because one of the things I realized early on is that we can choose how we're going to show up in the world.
And welcome to yet another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It is Luciano here as your host. And as usual, before we get into our next conversation, I do want to remind the listener, please, if you haven't already done so, do take the time, take a minute or two out of your life to rate us, and then to share with your dear family and friends. And again, as most listeners know, we are a not-for-profit, have been for many, many years, and also recently a charity. So we issue tax receipts to those donors who wish to donate to the cause. And our mission, as everybody here knows, or regular listeners, is to explore the what ifs and the why nots with people around the world who have been doing just that. So people who are in the arts, people who are in business, people who have corporate positions in society, scientists, philosophers, you name it. We're having some really wonderful exploratory conversations with people and learning a hell of a lot as we've gone along here. We've been doing this for 3 years, and we don't want to stop. So we all give our time here. And if you're so inclined, you can just go to our website and figure out where you can go and donate again if you'd like. So that's behindgreatness.org. Here we go, man. So today we're joined. Oh, Scarlett, where are you? Where are you joining us from? I don't have that in my notes.
Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta. Okay, I remember that. I don't have that in my notes. Okay, so Scarlett Heinbuch is joining us from Atlanta. She's worked in the financial services field, including Fortune 500 companies in banking and brokerage for more than 20 years. She is also an internationally known researcher and theorist in the area of women's financial health and social norms theory. In her other world, Scarlett has had, let's stick with had, childhood near-death experience, an NDE, at the age of 4, in which she was out of her body and felt the love and awareness of the universe. After returning to her life, she found her spirit had retained the capacity to explore other worlds and encounter other beings in multiple realms. She has used these multidimensional capabilities to help others in whatever world she finds herself. Scarlett holds a PhD in public policy and administration from Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, and a master's degree in public health, an MPH from VCU's School of Medicine. Scarlett is also, on top of everything else, she is also certified in Reiki, hypnotherapy, and neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. Lastly, she's the author of the upcoming book, We Met on the Other Side. And you can find out a little bit more about Scarlett at her own website, scarlettheinbuch.com. Her last name is HEINBUCH.com. It'll all be in the show notes. Thank you for joining us, Scarlett.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today, Luciano.
And happy to have somebody named after a color. So you're our first.
Well, that's good. Nice to be first.
Yes. Bruce Grayson, I guess, is a distant second, Gray being there in the last name. Okay. So I wanted to thank, first of all, Charlotte. Nice. Because I was combining Sharon and Scarlett. Sharon Hewitt-Rawlette, who was also a guest on the podcast probably now a year ago. Again, we had a wonderful conversation, and we've kept in touch. And she said, "You got to speak to Scarlett." And then, of course, Jeffrey Kripal, who also endorses you indirectly, who's also been on this podcast. And he runs something. This is, I guess, the first question. He runs something at Rice University called the Archives of the Impossible. Is that right?
Yes.
And you were part of that recently. What was that about? Let's get started on that.
Okay. Well, that's a great thing. And first, I would like to acknowledge Sharon Hewitt-Rawlette, Dr. Rawlette. She's amazing. And she's also, I've been honored that she wrote the foreword to my book. It's very meaningful because she's a brilliant parapsychologist. And I'm just delighted to have her knowledge and expertise. So I want to thank her for that.
That's awesome.
And I was just privileged to be there at Rice University at the Archives of the Impossible event that Jeffrey Kripal has put together. From my understanding, this was the second event. I was able to do a flash talk for 25 minutes about my experience that we will talk about later. But the event itself is really exploring these concepts that we call impossible because they often don't make sense in the normal air quotes world. So these are people who are leading academics, theorists, experiencers, people who are highly credible, solid researchers who are looking into the experiences that we're having and giving voice to them. As you pointed out, I mean, these are things that are not in the typical realm, and people from all walks of life are putting these experiences out there in a world that can often be challenging to folks who share these unusual things. So that's what the conference is all about. It's really looking at things that people would call impossible by people who are pretty normal having these experiences.
So you told me about this a few weeks ago, and I'd heard about it, but it was in my memory bank. And so you jostled it when you mentioned it. And I went to the website. I'm going to paraphrase one of the taglines that they use. Something to the effect is, it was a quotation. It was quoting somebody. Something to the effect of, I didn't say it was possible. I just said that it was true. So cheeky. I love it. Okay. So I think you just used the word normal. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So we hear an overusage of the word, and it's got nothing to do with how you've just said something, normal and paranormal. I've grown a likening, to the word natural. I got hooked on the word natural when we spoke to Stephen Dick, who is a former chief historian at NASA, an astrobiologist, and with Mark Gober very early on in the podcast. What do you say to that when I say to you, not normal, but natural?
Well, I think, again, it's a matter of perspective, right? Because what's natural for one person or normal may be out of the norm for someone else. We can only view things from the perspective of our experiences and our knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so if you have had experiences and knowledge, it will be natural or normal to you, but it might not be to somebody else. So it really depends. I view these terms as interpretive and experiential based on where people are coming from in their lives.
Okay. So the follow-up question then is, why should we use the word paranormal?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because paranormal assumes that things that are outside of the normal realm, that there's some other framework for normal. And I think that's what we're all trying to challenge. What are we saying is normal and what are we saying is not? And so when we look at things as paranormal, we're saying that if it's that the normal experiences of our five senses is all there is. And I think folks like me and at the conference and others that you've talked to are challenging that because we're talking about another sense and people want to call it the sixth sense. Well, that's my normal. So I don't view that as paranormal because it's my normal. But people who maybe aren't quite attuned to their sixth sense might not have any kind of understanding of what that looks like. So it's not normal to them. So that's what I mean when I say we have to look at the person's experiences and what their normal is. Because to me, there's nothing para about it. It is my normal. It's the way I live my life. And I know we'll talk about my NDE, but that's hugely influential in I have that opinion.
Okay, well, I'm with you so far. I'm following you so far, so far I agree with your perspective, and that's because you see, here's the difficulty. I think with human beings, that's because I've had experiences. One of them fairly profound. I've never shared it. I'm not sure if I'm going to just yet, but but before I've had this one profound experience, I started to open up to the fact that maybe the small instances of experiences that I had throughout my life were real rather than a figment of my imagination, because it was easy. It's always been easy for me and for most people I know who've had little experiences, call it experiences of maybe intuition, starting with something like that, like thinking about somebody and then the phone rings is that person's calling you. Or writing down, this happens often, writing down a couple of words while you're listening to somebody speak and you're writing down the same words that person is speaking at the same time. That's almost daily for me, almost. Little things like that. Once I started to pay attention to those, I started to understand, and I have been understanding that there is something, there's something, I was going to say normal, I just caught myself, natural about these occurrences. And that's what piques my interest. If I think in terms of this being a natural phenomenon rather than a paranormal phenomenon, then it's something that I feel like it's in my reach to understand. And it's not something outside of me,
Right.
So I didn't need to have that one particular experience to start thinking that way. But since I had that experience, I have been open to the fact that, very open, that we are not just the shells that are speaking right now to each other. We are much more than that. And so that's why we have people on the podcast like you. So enough of that. Enough of me. You had an NDE at 4 years old. Did you know that was an NDE then? Explain. Give us a little bit of context.
Okay. Well, when I was 4, I had a drowning incident in the neighborhood pool. And what I can recall from that experience, it's been a long time ago, and this was before the word or the phrase near-death experience was even coined. So there were language for it. But what happened was I swallowed water. I ended up in the deep end where my feet no longer could touch the bottom of the pool, and I couldn't swim, and I was gulping water, and then everything went black. And then I was on the bottom of the pool, and the way I knew that was because there was me outside of my little 4-year-old body hovering at the edge of the pool looking down. I could see my body and the little pink cap that I was wearing on the bottom of the pool. Now, I didn't really have a sense of separation. There's not like you're analyzing the experience. I just knew that was my body on the bottom of the pool and that I was hovering, seeing this body, knowing it was mine, and my consciousness, for lack of a better term, was there. So I had no question about these things. The terminology, it didn't even matter. I was just experiencing myself in 2 dimensions at that point, one unconscious on the bottom of the pool and one conscious not in a body. So what happened was my mother saw me. It's a long story, but she's a nurse. And at that time, she had my brother and sister were there, and she was keeping an eye on all of us and got distracted. And that's when this happened with me. So she didn't see me bobbing up and down where I had been. And then she came to the pool. And even though there was a lifeguard, the pool was busy that day. So she saw my body on the bottom of the pool. She jumped in and got me and brought me back. Now, here's what's interesting, Luciano, is being in that experience of out of my body and observing my physical body, I knew also that I was surrounded in this place of complete bliss, peace, love. It was just an incredible feeling of just indescribable love and peace and awareness. Just aware, the 360 awareness, if you will. It was just powerful, and I could feel my mother's feelings too. I was aware that I had a choice because Mom told me recently when we were discussing this experience, and I added it to the book, and I had not put it in the original edition because I just didn't even realize that was the thing that opened the door. But we can go there a little bit further. But anyway, when she pulled me out, she said I was blue and I wasn't breathing. And she said, for a while, you weren't with us. So she knew I was not alive at that point. And I knew I had a choice whether I wanted to come back. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but I did feel my mother's feelings. I felt her grief and her panic, and love also was what brought me back, because I loved my mother very much and I knew she loved me, and I knew that her heart would be broken and that she wouldn't ever get over this if I didn't come back. So my spirit knew, even in that moment of floating out of my body, that this life journey was going to be difficult. And so I chose to come back, and I came back.
So I have two questions there. I'm going to forget the second one for sure, because this first one here, I'm trying to figure it out as I go, as I'm listening to this. That's awesome that as a 4-year-old, you felt the love for your mother and the attachment to your mother to make that choice. And in your words, you said you didn't want to do it, but you did it for the love of your mother at 4 years old. So at surface level, I'm not belittling this at all. So, but at surface level, listening to this, I'm thinking, yeah, I was 4 and my mother was my world. Period. Right. And your mother's your world. Now, what if you were thinking that because you and your mom might be the same being? And if you are the same being incarnated, split, I'm just thinking, like, these are the things I think about. And you are split in human form. Maybe what you were feeling coming back is actually your mother not wanting to lose you. It's not you not wanting to go to your mother.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. I'll have to think a little bit more about that, because I know that I was feeling her feelings too, of her not wanting me to go. I could feel her, and I did feel that was coming from her, but I think it's a both and. Let me put it that way, is that she didn't want me to go. And I also loved her so much that I knew that I knew I had a choice to make in this moment. It's possible that she might not have been able to revive me if I feel that I had made the choice that I wasn't going to go. And when I talk about being in that love too, remember too well, I can't say to remember if you haven't had that experience, but there's a neutrality to this love. There aren't words to describe it. It's not a clingy type of love. You are just a love. It's just an amazing type of every kind of love. And I talk about that later too, in the experiences that we'll talk about. But so there's an acceptance of whatever you choose is fine. And I know if I had chosen not to come back, I think that would have been okay. But there's always consequences in life and in the afterlife for every choice you make. I feel, and I've experienced, and I know that the consequences of my mother's pain were greater to me than my choice to move on and stay in that peace, because it's certainly compelling to be in a place of total bliss and love rather than to be back in this world, which is not often very loving and can be very jarring.
So when I asked you about your siblings growing up, you have a brother and a sister, and I asked if you were close, and your answer was this: alcohol consumption ruins relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to infer, so you tell me if I'm completely off, I'm going to infer that that kind of heaviness that brings affects your non-physical existence.
Well, yes, it does. I grew up in an alcoholic home. Not my mother, but my father had a drinking problem, and it was not fun at all. And anybody of the listeners who've grown up in an alcoholic family know exactly what I'm talking about. It brings a very heavy energy into the home, however it manifests. And so, that had already started in our young years, and it was very, very difficult to be around somebody who's an alcoholic, because behaviors generally are unpredictable. Mm-hmm. They're frightening for children. There's in our home, there was too much yelling and screaming, and being a particularly sensitive child, and even more so after my near-death experience, because having that portal to love opened that way, and then being in this life where things were so hard, it was just painful. More painful, I think, because of that acute sensitivity, because I knew that there was a better option to live and to be, and to see it was like being in a world of people who can't see anything else, and they're just living their lives in pain and their own pain, inflicting pain on others, as though they're completely unaware that there's a spiritual dimension. But being at a young age, at 4, you don't have the vocabulary or the language or the cognitive processing skills to be able to know how to even articulate these things. It's only in the look back now and having these kinds of conversations where you can say, wow, my spirit knew that this was going to be a heavy experience. And, and I talk about that also in the book. I'm very open about that. And I chose that too. You mentioned earlier about having the courage to be honest in these types of conversations, because those are experiences too in the real life. And they're very normal there, and they can be natural for folks, but, alcohol in and of itself is not a problem. It's the abuse of it that is. And it's the fallout from that is. So people experiences these things. And I'm sure you've heard more than your share of folks. One commonality I've noted in people who are often deemed to be psychic or very intuitive is many of them come from traumatic backgrounds. And I think there's something very important to note there. And we can get onto that later too. But
that's also interesting too. Well, just a quick point on that. That's very interesting because the overconsumption of alcohol. So but I'm not a saint. I'll drink alcohol. I never abuse it, or rarely abuse it. But I'm a pretty sober guy. I have a family and have responsibility and so forth. So I never fell to that addiction, but the heaviness that abuse brings to your inner circle is indisputable, just as you had described. But it's also, I think, it pushes people who are already predisposed to exploring beyond the veil to explore there, just based on a necessity to escape the heaviness. So if you're already, because you mentioned that you were a sensitive child, if you're already a sensitive child and you're already floating in that space, then it might be easier for you to linger around, ask more questions, like more natural for you, ask more questions, explore, just so that you can avoid the heaviness. And then because of that, you tend to explore more than others.
When we have our experiences, we're talking about two very significant, impactful types of experiences. One is having a childhood NDE before the age of 5 has been well documented to show that you are changed, but you don't know it. It is your normal.
Yeah.
And growing up in an alcoholic family, that's a whole different dynamic too, and another set of challenges. So I think what you're getting at is that both of these are out of the normal for most folks. Fortunately, alcohol abuse and alcoholism in families is ubiquitous, but it's not everyone's normal. So, but when you do have those challenges too, on top of being a sensitive and aware person, it does make you choose to explore things in a different way, because you really don't have too much choice not to. You have to find your emotional safety valves in toxic situations. But I'll say too that having the near-death experience, when I think about it, also taught me to be more loving and compassionate, because even though it was difficult, I also understood my father was in pain. And it was years later that I found out, that he suffered from severe depression and had childhood traumas of his own and no tools or help. And so you learn to have compassion for people's pain. That doesn't make you a doormat. Don't get me wrong. And it doesn't mean that you don't learn boundaries or get out of bad situations, because that's critically important. But what it does mean is you can have compassion for people. And that's the main thing I think that is so important that we're missing today is we get so paranormal, polarized, good, bad. Everything is binary rather than non, which is we can love people who aren't good for us. We can care about people who are not well. But we also have to value ourselves too. And so there's a lot of lessons here about love and care and how to be in the world and how to show up in the world, in a world where most people are in pain. And that's what I find. People are just suffering in different ways. And it brings out the healer in my heart. And that's what I learned too, even at 4 years old, is, I'm here to help people heal. And I had to go through my own healing and my own painful journeys, maybe in some ways that seemed more extraordinary than I would have liked. But they taught me compassion. They opened my heart in a greater way. It taught me to be non-judgy about people and to love them where they are. And these are the fruits of these experiences. So, they were tough to live through, but they're also the gift. And again, it's about attitude perception too, about how we look at our things in life.
I think you noticed I was laughing a little bit, and not because I found anything funny. I was laughing because those were a few minutes there in your answer of a lot of strong wisdom. So I was excited about hearing it, and that's why. So I'll just add a quick note to that. I just had a conversation with a friend of mine in Mexico City. I was just traveling. I told you I was just traveling this week, and we had dinner, and we were talking about our experiences, professional and personal, and so forth. And we discussed how, if you take the perspective of thinking or believing that adults around you in your life who you maybe didn't get along with or maybe mistreated you, if you look at them as damaged children, then your perspective would change. And using your word, compassion would be one of the top on the list for you to reach out. And I'm not saying that right. I'm trying to be too poetic about it, but compassion comes easier to you when you think in those terms. So that's, and you're not the first to say this, because there is a string, there's a thread here. So we've spoken to a few other people on the podcast who've had NDE experiences. One of them recently with Yvonne Kaysen. And she had an NDE when she was small as well, when she was 4 or 5 years old. And she said the same thing that you shared with me as well the last time, is that you said after your NDE, your connection with that NDE stayed open, and you had visits from relatives who had transitioned, relatives who had died on Earth. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Okay. Well, that was the thing that afterward that I was able to see people who had passed away, and they would visit. Or sometimes this is something really important too, is that doorway got opened. And here's what I want to say is that while I experienced the love and protection and sense of just divine well-being in that NDE experience, what happened was that the portal, for lack of a better term, was opened, and that means to other energies. So when I came back in my physical body, the filter wasn't there to really know how to deal with all the energies that were just coming through to me. It wasn't all positive. When I was a child, I'd see sometimes frightening faces at bedtime. It frightened me. It was like these spiritual faces would just show up, and I would pull the covers over my head. I was scared. I didn't know where or who oftentimes they were. And then I would know things that were going to happen. I was able to see with my mind's eye, and I use that term because it's not your physical eyes, but I was seeing with my mind's eye things, people and other places. So that would happen. I put in the book about how we would be even in conscious mode. I'd be somewhere and I knew somebody was somewhere else that they weren't supposed to be. I could sense them. I could see them there. And I use the thing about my Uncle Howard, who, when I was probably 7 or 8 and we're riding with my parents somewhere, we'd gone and I'm sitting in the back seat and my mind shifts to I'm at my house and I'm seeing my Uncle Howard knocking on our door. And and he's perplexed that we're not home because we weren't supposed to. I don't know if we were supposed to be home or whatever, but he was knocking on the door, and I saw him jot down a little note. He always had a little pocket pen, and he left a note in the door. So I told Mom and my dad, and I said, Uncle Howard's at our house. And they said, no, he's not. He knows, no, he's not supposed to come over today. We don't have any plans. And I said, well, he's there at the house. And they just shushed me basically. And so, I don't know. I just know he's what I'm seeing in the backseat of my car, seeing him at the house. So, of course, we get home and there's the note in the door that Uncle Howard just happened to be in the area and stopped by. These things happen all the time. I think my parents just got used to it, and they quit arguing with me. But after a while, too, like people, it's like, how many times do I have to say things that happen? And then just knowing things. And these weren't always pleasant things. Like when my grandfather was getting ready to die, I woke up that morning and I knew he was going to die at 11:17 that night. The number flashed in my head, and he did. He did. We were with him when he drew his last breath, and we had some posters in the closet. He was staying with us and at the time, and they all fell down, and his car, the horn went off at his moment of death. And I was like, wow, a lot of energy going on here. And I also talked too about my aunt. I call her Marion in the book out of respect for her living family. These are experiences. Now, this was in 1976, and I think I mentioned this to you. We had the black rotary dial phone.
Love
this is
those.
And we were on a party line in the country. So Aunt Marion had died at only 51 years old, and my mother and she were close, although she was much older than my mom. She was, I think, 12 years older or so, and so my aunt was more like a mother to my mom and her only sister.
Mm-hmm.
So when she died at 51 from breast cancer that had been diagnosed way too late, this was in 1975. Mom was just so bereft. And so she was grieving really hard and just having a tough time coping with her depression and sadness and around her sister's loss. And so I was home. I'd had a dream about my aunt visiting me. And in the dream state, it was like 3 days after she had actually died. And when she showed up, she looked kind of scary to me because she looked like she was decaying. Now, years later, I learned about that being the etheric body showing up when someone's newly dead. And that's another thing to talk about. But anyway, her message was, please tell your mom to stop grieving. She's holding me back. And I didn't understand that, but that's what she was telling me. So I told my mother this. And then that day, it was months had gone by. My grandmother, who's Pennsylvania Dutch, and I talk about her in the book, had an experience where she said her daughter, my mom's sister, came into her bedroom and appeared to her at her bedside and told her the same thing. Please tell my mom to stop grieving. She's holding me back. And my grandmother said that my aunt looked as real to her as though she were there in the flesh. And Grandma was a tough Pennsylvania Dutch woman. She was not given to flights of fancy, but this was her normal too, being a Pennsylvania Dutch woman. And so she told my mother that. Well, again, Mom still wasn't recovering. And then this day I'm at home. It's middle of the day, like 3 p.m, and then that rotary dial phone rings. And this is the part that freaked me out, even with all these unusual experiences. This is my first interface with technology. So I answered the phone, and there's this crackling on the line, which isn't unusual for a rural line. And I hear her say my name, and she says, Scarlett, and I recognized her voice. And I said, I'll say Marion. And I said, Aunt Marion? And she said, yes, honey. And it's crackling, but it's her voice. And I said, and I'm kind of like stunned. I'm like, Aunt Marion, you're dead. And she said, I know, honey. But she said, please tell your mom to stop grieving. She's holding me back. Well, I was so freaked out. I slammed down the phone. I don't know why. I just ran outside. I was home.
I would have done the same. I would have done the same.
And it's like, well, what being outside, I just had a panic, fight, flight, or freeze, right? I ran out of the house. And I was so terrified. I was just freaked out. I had the hair on my arm. I mean, everything was on end. Now I realize too, you're using an electronic device, a telephone, even if it was a landline, you're using some sort of electronic communication. So I think there was all of that going on. And then just how she was able to do it. And I would have written this off if it were a dream or some other experience. But this was just me being a teenager, totally awake in the middle of the day, no thunderstorms, nothing strange. And this happened. I had never heard of phone calls from the dead before. Now it's a thing. Everyone's talking about it. But this was 1976 when this happened.
Nobody was talking about that.
No.
Nobody was talking about that.
No. And of course, I'd already felt like a weirdo anyhow.
Well, yeah, that's okay. We'll get to that in a second here too. In our conversation with Robert Doyle, we talked about speaking to people on the other side after they've passed. There was an Italian scientist who developed a necrophone, I think in the 60s, to talk to his deceased wife using, actually, I think it was radio signals. He was trying to use radio signals. But we're trying to get on a podcast a particular professor who's working on a necrophone. And I think he developed it for the same reason, if I'm not mistaken. When you were seeing, you said frightening faces. Were these faces human faces? Did any of them communicate to you?
Well, I would say all the faces were human faced, but they looked scary to me. They looked like they were suffering. And it was, but being a child, what do you do with that? And they weren't people I knew. Now, it was interesting that those things would happen, but it was a nightly occurrence. And now I know that one of the things I would like to spend some time doing is helping kids who've had NDEs learn to put up some barriers, because no one told me that I could say no to these spirits or these things. You don't know that you can say no. You just are having things and you don't know that there's ways to put up barriers and protect yourself. And I hear a lot of people talking about that even now as adults, they don't know that they don't have to be at the mercy of these energies. There are ways that you can learn to protect yourself. Not always. Can be energies that are going to come through even still, but there's still things that you can manage about it. But at the time, again, there wasn't really anyone to talk to. I don't mind dating myself. We're talking the mid 1960s here. Again, before there was any real solid research other than the typical things in alternative areas. But yeah, so there just wasn't a lot of help or support.
And there still really kind of isn't, although the world is where I'm finding the more people we speak to with similar experiences to yours or adjacent experiences to yours, we find that there's a bustling happening. And there are a lot of people supporting each other, which is really, really nice. Really, really nice to know. But wanting to disseminate the information, which is probably more important, like what you're doing with your book and what you did with, and we haven't even talked about that too, with some of the media that you've been involved in. Yet. We haven't talked about it yet. Sorry, let me go back to your mother because I had a thought and I forgot now it came back. And this question, please, has got nothing to do with my thoughts on your mother. It's got to do with my brewing thoughts on how we might exist outside of our bodies. If we assume, humor me, if we assume you, your aunt, and your mom, and say your grandmother are the same. You are the same being, call it spiritually, whatever, same soul, and you're split. So when you've incarnated or reincarnated, whatever, on the planet, you've kind of split, but you're part of the one. It could be that your mother, as the incarnate slice of the same being on Earth, is or was holding her sister back and holding you back because her beliefs, maybe her non-physical beliefs, were different than yours and your aunt's, even though you're the same being. I don't know if that question came out clearly.
Well, I think that's an interesting viewpoint. And I think when we ponder the concept of souls inhabiting simultaneously bodies, either in the same time zone or place. Split souls is a concept. You know, well, there's a lot to unpack with that, Luciano, but I would just say this. I think that when we are in our families, there is a reason and purpose. So if our souls are splinters for perhaps of one, or just manifestations of the same type of soul, but we're all linked up together somehow. Obviously we are. We're there for a reason. But with my mother too, and she's still with us today, and I'm very grateful for that. But when I was saying about holding us back, what I realized is that our love for her was so great that we didn't want to leave her. And I think that's the point. I didn't want to leave my mother because I loved her so much, and she loved us too. But
Sure.
it was a choice to love, and the same with my aunt. My choice. She was ready to go on. She left her physical body, and she was ready to go on to what was next for her. But what was holding her back was not so much my mother as it was her love for my mother. She didn't want to leave her.
Okay. So
Does that make sense to you?
yeah. Well, of course that makes sense. And maybe the being that is the three of you, let's say spiritually, the three of you is in a tussle. And when you're crossing over, like when you were crossing over at 5, when the being was crossing over at 5, it manifested in you, and that being before, and that being that was crossing over at 51, that's manifested in your aunt. Those slices of beings did not have the belief system to move on, and were attaching to the familial love that they had with the remaining being in your mother.
Well, it's interesting to know, but I think the core message is it's about love, right? We make choices about
Sure.
love, and we make choices whether we're out of our body and in a near death, or we're, as my aunt was, she was totally dead in the physical body,
Yeah.
but her spirit was now fully in the other realms. But her love, the connection and love, that's what we're really talking about here. Those are the tentacles that keep us connected to one another, whether it's from mom's direction, my direction, or some sort of tri-direction and our group area of connection. But the whole point is love. That's really it.
So as you're saying this, I have other thoughts. So maybe this is the last one. You mentioned earlier on in the conversation that the love that you were experiencing when you were 4 in a near-death experience was it was an all-encompassing 360 kind of love, and it was a neutral love. It wasn't a romantic love.
Right.
Maybe, again, this is like the what if. Maybe the love that as a daughter, and the love as an aunt, and the love as a sister, love as a mother is a strong love, but maybe it's a love that is a slice of that 360 neutral love that you were talking about. And that belief in that as a stronger source of love is what's holding back the transition.
Well, it can be. When we talk about visits from other sides, so many things they're all relationship based. When people have experiences with loved ones who have passed on, the key is loved ones, right? They're people that either they don't want to let go of, or those on the other side don't want to let go. And it's hard or maybe they both don't want to let it go. So lots of times when these spiritual energies keep those connections in a way where they're still present, either whatever dimension they're in, but there's still some sort of connection. I mean, that's the challenge, I think, too, for folks is loving, letting go, letting everybody have the perfect expression of where they are. I mean, that's the respect of the universe too. We all have, what did my mom need to learn from the potential loss of me? What did she need to learn from losing the actual loss of her sister? What did we need to learn? What did my aunt need to learn about her leaving her beloved sister? When I feel the universe and these questions, at the heart of it and is love. These are the connections that keep us connected. in spirit and in in this earthly journey. We all know that this journey is coming to an end at some point. But when I think about the experience I had at 4, knowing that there's something outside my physical body that continues, that's conscious, and then the encounters I've had with beings on the other side, and whether they're strangers, multidimensional beings, which we'll get to later, deceased relatives, the core component again is consciousness, it's love, it's connection. And what are we supposed to do with this? Really? It's like, what's the point? So when we have these discussions about what these things could be, and people have asked me, and I could trot out a whole book of experiences, but in the end, it's the bottom line is, how is this going to help folks? Because one of the things I realized early on is that we can choose how we're going to show up in the world. We can choose to be loving and kind. We can choose otherwise, but it is a choice. And we've all been handed tough challenges in life. I've just had these discussions recently with people who've had, one kind of hardship after another, and they're like, they're bitter, they're angry, they're sad, they don't know how to cope in the world. And I think, well, right, but you do know how to cope. You can cope. It's an attitude of perception. You get to choose how you are going to respond or react to situations in your life. And you do get to choose your attitude. That doesn't mean that things aren't going to be hard or challenging, but and that doesn't mean that we dismiss true hardship, nor do we become what I call a joy bully, which is telling people they can't feel their feelings. I find that offensive, quite frankly. If people are sad or depressed, we don't try to cheer them up in a false way. People have to feel their feelings with fullness, and they have to be held in a sacred space, whatever they're feeling, and let them feel it. We can't tell people to shut up about their feelings or their pain or their grief or their happiness. And we just have to be a little more authentic in this world with one another. And we also need to find out how we can be more loving and kind and thoughtful and compassionate. And that's what these experiences are all about. And that's the irony, isn't it, though, is when we're talking about these unusual experiences, whether we call them paranormal or whatever term we use, they're not in most people's normal everyday way of being, except that they are.
Okay, very good. I went halfway. You went full. I said they can
I'm
be, and
going
you
to say
said
that they are. I think that we are on an evolutionary shift pattern. And I talked about this in 2005 in an international conference in Istanbul about toward a higher consciousness, using the sixth sense and developing it more for world peace. Now, that sounds like a pretty lofty way to put some pretty tough concepts together. But my point being is, when we begin to understand, and most NDEers will say this, when you understand that you are connected as a human family, that we really all are of a human family. Maybe we're all splinters of one big source. But when you get that, then we're family. So if you're family and you love one another, who cares what color your skin is? Who cares whether you're non-binary or your gender or your orientation? Who cares what your religion is? It's about love. It's about care for one another, and it's acceptance. And that's where we keep stumbling here over and over. We keep focusing on divisions of, well, if you have this experience, you're weird, or I haven't had that experience, therefore,
that's
if
the
I
messiness.
can't understand.
That's the messiness of the earth existence.
Exactly.
And we have to divide in order to unite, but we're uniting in small splinters, always.
Right.
Always
right.
on earth. And we know that when we die, that we all know, doesn't matter what your belief system is, we all know that when you die, those divisions don't matter.
No, they don't.
We all know that. All of us know that.
Right.
Why can't we carry that forward? Because if we can consciously carry that belief forward, that same belief that everybody has, it doesn't matter when you die, then why not enact that now is the question. Like, that's what I get. That's the feeling I get talking to people like you and listening to what you've just been saying in the last few minutes too. Okay. But you have another story.
Yes. So let's get to that one.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Because I'm not even going to set it up. You just go.
All right, because all the things we've been talking about have led to that. Now, everybody likes a love story. So let me just state up front that that's what this ultimately is. And it's a story about how I met the man who ultimately became my husband. So, spoiler alert, he lived. Anyway, so it is also a documented medical miracle that was featured on the History Channel. And I want to point that out because, as you mentioned, I'm a scientist at heart and I like evidence. I like verifiable facts. And so everything in our story has been verified by doctors. Multiple physicians have reviewed all of the medical records to verify that when we say that there's an unexplained component of what happened here, it truly is. And so we were on the TV show The Unexplained with William Shatner on the first season that focused on some of the most unusual elements of our story. But bottom line was, I met this man who his name is David, and I met his mother at an AA meeting in Richmond, Virginia in 2005. And I had gone to that meeting, even though I had been concerned about my own drinking because I was a stressed out single mom. I was a grad student at the time. And I felt like, given my family's history with drinking and intolerance, and also I have some Native American roots and some intolerance just from genetics, I was concerned that I was drinking too much and I did not want to go down that pathway. So I took myself to a meeting and realized that the recovery tools were really useful, whether you had a drinking problem or not. It just taught you how to accept responsibility for yourself and find a better way of being in the world. So I thought, well, that makes sense to me. So, but I was busy with school. I'd stopped going to meetings, but I'd stayed kind of in loose contact with some of my friends in the program of recovery. And I'd been hearing about this man who had come in from the West Coast and now was in the hospital and in fact was dying and had taken a sudden horrible downturn and wasn't expected to survive over a period of weeks. He had been in an unresponsive coma on life support and everything, multi-system organ failure. And he wasn't going to make it. And so folks I knew were telling me, oh, how awful this was. He was truly a nice guy. And his mother was flying into town that night. The hospital had called her that day to come to Richmond. She was in the West Coast too, and told her that he had taken the turn down and that if she wanted to come say goodbye, she needed to get there today. So she flew in to Richmond that night and she came to the meeting that evening. And I had decided to go, even though I hadn't gone in a while, because my former sponsor was picking up a 20-year coin, so to speak. And so I wanted to be there to support her. Like I said, I didn't know David, so I didn't know what was really going on. But anyway, I just knew, well, this was the sad thing. Well, I met David's mother that night, and her name is Mama D. I call her now, even though she's not with us any longer. But there was something about her. She was standing there. She was thanking everybody for all that they had done for her son and all the love and support they'd shown him as he'd been here in Virginia for 10 months on a contract job, and really found a home in this community. And she'd also been in recovery for 30 plus years, she and her partner, and and just was thanking everybody. But yet it was too late. She said she had just signed the funeral directives and had just come from the hospital, and they didn't expect David to make it through the night. And so for folks who are medically oriented, I'll just say, just so that they can understand the severity of this, he did have what at that time was called Wegener's granulomatosis, which is a very rare form of vasculitis in which granulomas are like little nodules that form in the whole vascular system, and they attack the organs. They start in the sinuses, which he started out with thinking he was having an ear infection and eyes and nose, everything. And he had Bell's palsy. But what happened was he ended up in September, early September, thinking he was having a panic attack because his heart was racing and couldn't catch his breath. So let me back up a bit. And he goes to the hospital, which is a Catholic hospital near where he's living. And then overnight, he goes into the coma. They found out that he was going into respiratory failure. And then the rest went from downhill from there. He went to respiratory failure. He went into acute kidney failure. His lung collapsed. They had to put in a chest tube. He had double pneumonia. He had sepsis. He had blood clots. and he had cardiac arrhythmia. And then he had encephalopathy. And after being nearly 3 weeks on the ventilator and life support and the feeding tube, he was in the unresponsive coma, had not regained consciousness, and everything was shut down and was not responding to the treatment protocol. They gave him blood thinner, heparin for the blood clots, and he had an allergic reaction for that. So folks told us that at any point, any one of those things would have been fatal, but the combination was not survivable. And so when all that night, when his mother was there and had signed the paper, that was it. He had not responded to the treatment protocol. His kidneys were destroyed at that point. They were damaged from the granulomas, and there was no recovery from that. And they said even if he lived, which at that point didn't look likely, he would probably have brain damage because he had not gotten enough oxygen to his brain now from the ventilator, and his kidneys would never regain function. It was looking to be a horrible prognosis anyway it went. So anyway, that night I met her. She touched my heart, and there was something about her that moved me. Now, I had mentioned too, as a single mom, both of my sons had disabilities. So I had studied Reiki to try to help my sons. That's why I got my master's in public health. I wanted to understand if there were better ways to approach their conditions from a neurocognitive way. My oldest son had severe ADHD and learning disabilities, and my youngest had epilepsy. So what I found in my research was about the role of essential fatty acids, omega-3s. Now everybody's heard about fish oil, but back then no one knew much about it. So that's what I was researching is could there be some sort of deficit going on in their brain chemistry? So all these things I had prepped myself for led me up, and also consciousness. I had been studying consciousness pretty much since I was just a child, trying to understand what was happening for me and why. And so all of it, the spiritual component too. So anyway, so when I saw her, what was at the end of the meeting, I wanted to go up and just say to her how sorry I was. And this is one of those moments where what's going on in your mind does not match what comes out of your mouth. And what came out of my mouth was, I don't think you should give up hope yet. And to this day, I know that was not me talking. Because there was no logical reason for me to even say that when it was clear it was done, And she looked at me.
Almost sounded mean.
Well, and I didn't mean it mean. It was just, and I was shocked at myself for saying that. And I said, well, and I began to immediately backtrack. Like, well, what I mean is, if I do Reiki, I can't promise you anything. And I said, I'm really sorry for what you're going through. But if you would like for me to go to the hospital, with the assumption if he's even still there the next day, at least I told her I was on my prayer team, and I would be happy to hold his hand and pray with him if he was going to go. I wasn't scared of being with somebody in that condition. And if she would like that. And being from California, she understood Reiki to a point. And she said, well, he's Jewish. And I said, that is perfectly okay. This is not a religious thing. It's not disrespectful of anyone's religion. It's just energy. But being that he was in an ICU and I'm not a family member, she would have to give me permission to even go. And again, assuming he was even alive the next day. Now, just as background, I was, again, that graduate teaching assistant. I was a full-time was on my dissertation research at that point. I was a graduate teaching assistant 3 days a week or 2 days a week in criminal justice. And then I was an adjunct teaching a marriage and family relationships class, which was an upper level social science class. And we joke about that now, but it's relevant because of the classroom experiences. I had joked, well, I got that class by telling the professor, well, I made every mistake you can, so I can tell what the students what not to do. And that they thought that was kind of funny. And I said, so that's how I ended up teaching that class, which was amazing. And the students were amazing. And so much of what we were learning about love and relationships really factored into all this healing that was going on too. So so that happened. I met his mother on September 22nd, 2005. It was a Thursday night. Friday, I had to teach my class at noon. I didn't know if he was still alive. I hadn't heard back, but I left after class and went to the hospital. And there was some checking to see if my name was on even on the list, had it been added. And so I said my prayer. I was like, I don't know why I'm here. certainly can barely even afford the gas fumes to even go drive over to the hospital to see this complete stranger that I don't even know why I even said what I did. But I said I'd go, and he was still alive, apparently. So there I was. So I went in his room. They let me back. And I've never seen anybody in acute kidney failure. So I didn't realize their whole body is bloated, which he was. And he was just covered by the thin sheet. And the only thing, he just had bags and bags of lines of fluids keeping him going. He had the feeding tube because he'd been unconscious. He had the respirator. He had the central line in his neck. He had all of these things, and his catheter bag was blown dry. He was just really, his kidneys were just totally shot at that point. And I just saw, I mean, I couldn't even see what he looked like. He just had so many things on his face. And but I just felt really sorry for him. I was like, oh my gosh, I've never seen anyone that devastatingly ill. And I just was like, I don't know I'm here. But I remember Mom had always told me, even when people are in a coma, they can hear what you say. So talk to him like he's awake. And that's what I did. So I went up and introduced myself because he didn't know me. I told him who I was, why I was there. And I told him, a lot of people love you and care about you. And I met your mom last night, and I'm here because of her. And whatever you want to do is fine. And if you'd like me to work with you, I will. But if you don't, that's okay too. If you choose to go, just know that you are just surrounded by love and care, and it's going to be okay, whatever you choose to do. But if you do feel like you have some unfinished business and maybe you want to stick around and you'd like me to work with you, I'll wait for a moment till you give me permission, because that's the key. Even if he couldn't speak, it's still his journey and his choice, and I have to respect it. So I waited there for a moment, and I felt a little puff of air, and I realized that was some energy, and I felt like it was okay to work with him. Now the nurse in the ICU had her chair right outside the door, and so which I appreciated because they didn't know me. I'm a complete stranger, so she was keeping an eye on things. So I did I opened with a verbal out loud prayer to him, just thanking him for this time. And I took his hands very carefully not to dislodge the pulse oximeter he had, or the IV line he had also in his hand. And I just opened with a prayer and just said, again, why I'm here, and giving thanks for this time. And when I did feel a connection with him. I felt real compassion for him, even though I didn't know this man. And I told him too, if he decided he wanted to stick around, I would promise that I'd come back. And the choice was his. But so I worked with him. I did the energy work for about 15 minutes. I really could not feel much energy. I'm not even sure he was actually in his body at that point. I feel like he was hovering out of it. So when I finished up, I took his hand again to say goodbye and to reiterate my offer to return if he decided to stick around. But I really didn't know which way it would go. And as I was getting ready to leave, his hand, which again had no grip, it's like my hand was fused to his. And that's when I realized that his energy, his spirit was reaching back. And I kind of startled for a moment. I was like, because it was so powerful. And I said, okay. I recognize that there's somebody here. And I kind of laughed. And I said, okay, if you're still around tomorrow, I promise you I'll be back. Well, he was. And so I know we don't have that much time, but let me sum up. In 12 days, I worked with him nonstop not nonstop, but twice a day. I came to the hospital. I brought music. I brought tuning forks. I brought aromatherapy, lavender. I brought sesame oil to put on his feet because that's in the good omega-6, things like that. And I did energy work with him. And we had two extremely unusual experiences among so many that happened. But the two were one, and this is why I titled the second edition of my book, which originally was Waking Up to Love, to We Met on the Other Side, because that's where we met. And that was when I was holding his hand and my opening prayer. And this was about the 4th or 5th day in, and he was still hanging on. And then I was out of my body. And instead of being at his bedside, I'm in a place of incredible love, just like where I was with when I'd had my ND at 4 years old. But this is different because now I'm a woman and I'm experiencing this in a different way. And I was feeling like liquid lights of love. It was just so intense. And as I felt his hands, and then I was holding his hand in the cot, and then in this dimension, I'm now holding the hands of him, and there his spirit is. And I knew his spirit was just out of his body. He was in his near-death journey, and he was deciding whether he was going to go or stay. And that's where we met. And that's where my heart completely opened up. And that's where, when you talk about spirits, where I felt that he was my soulmate, my bashert, as they say.
Literally.
Yeah, I felt, yes. And how could this be? How could you meet your soulmate in a near-death experience while he's dying? I'm out of my body sharing this near-death with him. He's deciding whether he's going to leave or go. And now you know you love him and you love each other in that every kind of way that I've never experienced with another being before like that. And I was like, what do you do? I mean, I didn't even have time to question. I'm just experiencing this moment. And then I'm plunked back, and there I am standing at his bedside. He's still unconscious. And I'm like, what happened here? How is this possible that this nearly dead stranger who may not recover is like this love of my life? How can this be? What? And so I'm totally freaked out. I'm shocked. I'm not even, I don't even know how to process what the enormity of this feelings and these experiences. And because I've never had anything happen like that. It's totally different if you see someone from the other side, but to meet somebody in their near-death experience, I had never even heard of that.
Well, you're the first I've ever heard of, and we've listened to a lot of them and spoke to a lot of people.
Well, there's not been a term, so I've come up with shared near-death because I don't know another term, and I'm going to talk to Dr. Grayson about that. What's the right term to use? I don't know. Someone said, well, you were having an out of body. I said, well, yes, I was, but he was near death, and near death by default involves out of body. So yes, he's out of his body, but in a near death capacity. So
let me ask you, sorry, a quick question. When you met him there on the other side and you felt this love, and you came back, you felt like he was the love of your life. That love that you felt when you were with him on the other side, so as a soul or whatever out of your body, was that a romantic love that you were feeling? Or was that a different kind of?
It was that 360 kind of everything.
Right.
And that was the thing. It wasn't possessive. Like in most of my relationships, it's been, oh, you want this person in your life. You know, you'll won't be happy if they're not there. But this was completely different. In that moment, it was like this love, it was an eternal type of love. It was, I call it the forever type of love. And it would always exist, whether we did or didn't. It was in this realm. It was there. It was just there.
And you shared that. You were actively sharing. And so when you came back, when you plunked into your body, use your word, you felt like he was the love of your life. So this is more a romantic love when you plunked into your body.
In that sense, it was like I'd never experienced that kind of love with another being. And the fact that he was unconscious and a stranger, none of it made any sense. It was like, well, what am I experiencing here? So no, it wasn't like a typical traditional relationship love. It was a higher love. And when I say that, what I mean is this. Love in this context that I was experiencing, I wanted what was absolutely best for him. And if the best for him was that he needed to go on and complete his near death to a full death experience because his body was too devastatingly ill to return to without being permanently disabled and unable to function. And I was like, well, that's what love does. You want what's best for that person, no matter, even if it doesn't include you. So it was that kind of high level love. But I'm still a human being now. Now I'm still in my body and just exposed to this kind of love. And my human self certainly wants to experience this more fully in this dimension. But I didn't know how that was going to be possible. And none of it made any sense. So anyway, as I mentioned before, his kidneys had been destroyed by the granulomas that were part of the illness. And they said that as he began to recover a little bit and hang on, they began to perform a little bit more. And they said, well, that's not unusual for them to regain a tiny bit of function, but it's not going to be a full recovery. There's just not possible. And that's when I made the joke. Well, I said, well, let's continue, working on his kidneys, and kind of laughing with the nurses about it. Like, they were like, yeah, okay, eye rolling at me at that point, because it's not possible. But that later on, I guess a night or two later, I was getting ready for bed. And that's when we had this next very unusual experience that the show featured. And that I was in my room at home. But yet, as I mentioned, I can see my mind's eye in another place. Like I'd seen my Uncle Howard. Well, now I was getting in bed, and my mind now is in David's room at the hospital. And so I'm seeing him in the hospital, and around him are these 4 light beings they looked blue in color to me, but they were very tall. They looked humanoid. I mean, they had human features, but just sharper features. They moved in a way that's hard to describe, very quick, very, 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 like there's fluid. It's hard to describe the textures of how they could move, but they did. They were just moving really fast, but there were 4 of them, one at each end and on each side of the bed. And I saw a set of kidneys almost like on a holographic tray, or holographic energy kind of kidneys. And it's like they slid into his body. And I thought, well, what am I seeing here? It's almost like they're replacing his kidneys with these energy kidneys. And I thought, well, that's odd. And then what was unusual was I call him the lead doctor, because it looked like a medical team. Looked up from David, and it was like he saw my mind or my spiritual energy, and he nodded his head at me like we've got this. And I was startled at that. I was like, oh, he sees me. But I felt comforted. I was like, oh, this is a wonderful group of healers, or I didn't even know what or who they were, and I still don't. I'll tell you that. Or even what I was perceiving. Again, the logical mind, you just can't shut it off. So then I'm back in my room, and I perplexed by what had happened, wondering if I have fallen asleep, had some sort of odd dream. Except that I went into the hospital the next day. And I took my tuning forks, because I thought, I don't know what I have encountered, but so many weird things had gone on already in the healing, even beyond these things, with him being out of his body, showing up in my room. I could feel his eyes. We'd connect. I felt him around. So I thought, well, I'll take the tuning forks in just to make sure. We might need to do some calibration on those kidneys. So, again, I have a great sense of humor, because it's a good armor when you don't even know what the heck you're experiencing. It's like you have to kind of say, okay. So when I got to the hospital the next day, his kidneys started to ramp up and function, to the point that they called his nephrologist in, who had been checking on him anyway, but they called and said, hey, something's going on here. We don't understand what's happening. And that's when his nephrologist and the nurses and the doctors started calling him Miracle Boy. And that's what they called him. And his kidneys began to ramp up and function each day to where they made a full recovery. And there's no explanation for how that happened, because the granulomas and the scarring from them had been too destructive. And yet they were now fully 100% functioning. And there was no way that they could account for that. So we continued working. And over that 12-day period, when he woke up, and this is what he said, he remembered, and I put that in the book. I asked him to write his part. People ask us all the time what he remembers of meeting on the other side. And he said, remember, and we try to understand this. A lot of people have a conscious memory out of the body, even when they're in a near death. But people in a coma who've had a lot of medications to keep them alive, it may have clouded his recall. And it's not unusual for it to take 10 to 15 years for people to have the actual memory come back. So he doesn't have a conscious memory, he said, but he had a spiritual memory. And he said, when he woke up, he knew everything about me. He knew my suffering. He knew I was a mom. He knew I had trouble trying to help my children. He knew, he said he knew everything about me. He knew he loved me. He knew he was going to marry me. He just didn't know my name, because we'd never met, except what I told him he didn't remember.
Small detail.
Yeah, just a minor detail. Well, you talk about awkward. I mean, we're complete strangers to each other.
Yeah.
So you wake up, he wakes up in this coma. From his coma, I'm looking at this man that I've had this incredible love experience with, and I'm like, now we have to meet in real life. And it's weird because he's been sick. He doesn't know me, and I don't know what in the world's going on and how this could even be. And like I tease him all the time. I said, look, I wasn't trolling the ICU looking for a boyfriend. I can tell you that. You were not on my checklist. And so long story short, he did make a stunning recovery with no brain injury. It did take about 2 years for him to get his full lung capacity back. This happened 17, it's going to be 18 years ago this fall. He normally people who have Wegener's granulomatosis, which is now called polyangiitis, granulomatosis, I think. They've changed the name. Normally, if they do survive, they only live about 8 years because of the devastation. And he had really just a very severe case of it. He's certainly exceeded all those odds. His kidneys are still perfectly fine. His medical records have been reviewed by multiple doctors for the show and also for the doctor who reviewed them in the book. There is no explanation for how his kidneys regenerated. There's none.
Well, you have that explanation.
Well, I do. But again, it's definitely paranormal, right? And people say, well, who are the blue beings? Well, I don't know, but people say, well, maybe they're from this planet. I said, I did not experience them as planetary. I think of them as dimensional. The other thing is that in the Native American community, I think you mentioned Dr. Artie Six Killer Clark. I did not know this, but she'd written a whole book, and I found it a few years ago about space age aliens, I think is the name. But if you look her up, and she talks about these blue beings being known in the Native American community as helping and healing people in war situations, the Native Americans who were in World War I or II, I think, and that they've been around the Native American community for a long time. And she writes the stories that the folks told her and kept their anonymity. So that was eye-opening to me too. And then David and I were married 7 months after he recovered, and we've been together ever since. We just had our 17-year anniversary.
Congrats.
And yeah, thank you. And we're grateful. We have stayed in recovery. We're grateful at one day at a time, every day at a time. We try to use the second chance we both feel we've been given and this gift of this experience to share it now with others more openly. It took us 10 years before we even discussed what happened. We just couldn't even talk about it.
10 years.
10 years. Again, there's so many elements here. The unusual love story, how we met, and that out of body experience together in his near death.
And then he had to learn your name.
Right. and then the blue beings, and I all of it. It was just so unusual, even for me having unusual experiences. But the first time we did speak about it was in 2015 at an IANS conference, International Association of Near-Death Studies. And so we shared our story, and again, learned from there. It takes about 10 years to even process it. So it's like, okay, well, that makes sense.
Wow.
And and we met a man from Hungary named Tibor Putnaki, who also had an experience with the blue beings from his near-death experience. Well, he and David took one look at each other, and it was like they just knew each other. And Tibor didn't even speak any English, but they knew. And he'd written his book about his 9 minutes in heaven and talked about in the translated version about the blue beings. And I later got to get his account of that.
Very cool.
So there's a lot of international understanding of this. So when we shared the story, and at the very end, I was on the fence about whether to even mention it because it seemed so weird, even still, and said, well, this is how I perceived what I saw. And here's the outcome that we can't explain. And one of the lead researchers from IANS said at the end, at the question and answer, said, well, we've been hearing stories about the blue beings all over the world.
Yeah.
And that was news for me. So again, my weird, unusual experience I was finding out was maybe normal for a lot of people all over the world, just because I hadn't known about it prior to the encounter, it's like I wasn't set up for it because I didn't even know about
You didn't
it.
know
So
it. I think one of our recent guests, Michael Carter, explains in one of his experiences, he did describe this large being that healed a blood clot in his leg.
oh,
Middle of the night, just appeared, healed this blood clot, went to the doctor for the checkup on the blood clot, was no longer there. And he says, what am I going to explain to the doctor, that a being showed up at night and fixed me? So I just, whatever it is, just closed the file and left. But he mentioned he was tall, that this being was tall, like yours. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for sharing this. It's, I'm glad you didn't give the short version. And I'm not being sarcastic there, because that context, the context that you share, the background that you share is very important for the story, I think. So this is the first time you've relayed this story to me personally. So I've heard your story through other media, but this is the first time you've explained it to me. So I appreciate that you've gone through those details, because it's a banana story.
right.
It's, all the odds were against him and you for healing, and him for healing. So for me, I didn't experience it. It wasn't something personal for me. So I either believe you or I don't. And I choose to believe you. And that's the reason why we also get to know our guests a little bit before. So I've chosen to believe you. And I don't regret it at all, because it doesn't matter whether I believe that the beings were blue or red or tall, or you saw them or didn't see them. It happened, and you choose to be public about it. And you chose to heal because you wanted to. And you choose to heal because what I know about your background is that you choose to heal, and not for money. You're not a healer for hire, but because you want to. And those are really good brownie points for anybody, for any skeptic or inner skeptic.
Well, thank you and I do want to clarify, for a time after I wrote the first book, I thought, well, maybe my path is to work as a healer. And people said, well, so I had taken over a practice of an energy healer in Richmond. And, I had bills to pay. So I did charge at that time, but it didn't feel right to me. And that's when I recognized that for me, healing is a call. It's a calling. And there are some people I'm more effective with. And I just didn't feel right. To me, healing was a gift. And I don't mean that healers shouldn't charge for their time or their effort, because I'm not saying that. But for me, it didn't feel right. And so I had to do some real soul searching about all of that, about money and healing. And part of that's just my business background, which is, I feel if I'm charging money for a service, then I need to deliver. Right. And even though I know everybody's healing journey is up to them, if I'm the facilitator, I still want a good result. Right. Even if it's not up to me, I can't help but be human. And I couldn't promise anybody things, because I knew in my heart, it's really between them and their essence, whatever term you want to call it. And so anyway, long story short, I'm now working back in the financial services field. I try to help people in diversity, equity, and inclusion, make sure that they have a equal playing field and understanding of how our nation's economy works, how the payments system works, how I have a real heart for single moms and the struggles that they have, and anything I can do to educate them on how to use money as a tool energetically, how to move it around on invisible systems that they can't see. The cheapest way to do it, to me, it's all energy. It's all energy work and moving money around. And it was funny, we had this conversation earlier about, well, devoting more time to healing and energy and teaching. And I said, I do want to do those things. However, we live also in this practical, very tough reality. And exactly. And I said, it does no one any good to talk about, being self-actualized and all these concepts if you can't pay your light bill, or if you're struggling and you don't even know how to get a bank account or why that might benefit you, or how to manage your money. These are things that matter to people. Sure. So to me, that's healing too. you've got to learn to live in this world. And
Good point.
and we all know that there are healthcare disparities, and
Well,
folks who don't have money, and they need healing too. And I cannot stand, just in my heart, when people are in the way our health system is in the United States, where it is not a universal health coverage system. When people are already sick and at their worst, and in their pain, and now they have all these medical bills, I just, in my heart, cannot feel good about charging people for help and healing. I just can't. That's just me. That's my approach. I feel like it's an honor to serve people in this way, and I don't want to add to their stress or burden. That to me is unhealing. So this is just part of my feeling about it.
I mean, you share the same philosophy as Stefan Schwartz, who's been on this podcast. So you know Stefan?
Of him, yes.
Of him, yeah. Well, he's 80, 81 years old, and he's been working with quote unquote paranormal abilities in order to help heal and bring the message of wellness to people. And that has been his focus for the last 50, 60 years almost that he's been doing this. Amazing stuff that he's been doing. But what did I want to add? You can't explore these things. So we're privileged here because we can spend the time to discuss this. Mm-hmm. And there are people in countries like North Korea who are kept down through hunger. They can't possibly explore these things because their authority keeps them hungry every day, so that the only thing that's on their minds is, what am I going to eat next? Mm-hmm. So I appreciate the fact that we can spend an hour and a half here almost to discuss these things, because we have the capacity to pay the bills, and there is no outside authority pressing us for time. Actually, well, yes, outside authority is always pressing us for time. What am I saying? But you know what I mean, right? The energy of what I've just said. Okay, so last question. Let's close off. What is greatness to you?
Greatness to me is helping others succeed in life, and whatever way that means, whether it's healing a physical ailment, whether it's a spiritual ailment, whether it's a financial ailment, or whatever experience they're having that is not energetically aligned with their highest good. If you can help someone get aligned to their highest good, the other things tend to fall into place. And if I can leave this world a bit better, if I can show and have the courage to share my story in a world that often doesn't give room for it, I want to help normalize these experiences, because I believe that I'm not unique. I believe that what I have learned is teachable. I believe that anybody can do what I have learned. I don't think you need a near-death experience to access energy from the other side in a positive direction. But that to me is what greatness is helping other people be successful. And that is what brings me happiness. It brings me joy to see others thrive. And I think if we could really just focus on loving each other that way, that would be truly great. Those are wonderful closing lines. Let's just leave it at that. Scarlett, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of this. Thank you. Thank you, Luciano.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today? Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and share with your friends. And consider donating to help us produce more great conversations at behindgreatness.org/donate. Until next time.